He was once a quiet, gray figure in the shadows of the KGB, a man nobody noticed, a man no one feared. But today, he stands as one of the most feared and enigmatic leaders of the 21st century. A man whose name sends chills through European capitals, whose face is etched into the memory of global power shifts, and whose decisions shake the very foundation of world order. Vladimir Putin, the former spy who outplayed oligarchs, silenced dissenters, turned Russia into a machine of ambition, fear, and calculated chaos. But how did this unassuming operative, trained in the silence of East German alleyways, become a modern-day czar? To understand Putin is to enter a labyrinth, one woven from childhood trauma, Cold War paranoia, and a ruthless thirst for control. His story is not just the story of one man rising to power, it's the story of how the past never truly dies, how Soviet ghosts whisper into modern Kremlin walls, and how one man used that past as a blueprint for domination. Born in 1952, in the aftermath of World War II, Putin entered a broken world. His family lived in a crumbling communal apartment in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, where hunger and fear were as common as the bricks in the walls. His older siblings had died in infancy. His father was wounded in the war. His mother barely survived the Nazi siege of the city. These weren't just stories, they were scars, the kind that shape a child's sense of loyalty, loss, and vengeance. As a young boy, Putin idolized spies, not athletes, not movie stars. Spies, secret warriors of the Soviet Union. In his school essays, he didn't write about dreams of fame. He wrote about joining the KGB, and eventually that's exactly what he did. But contrary to the image of slick espionage portrayed in Western films, Putin's career in the KGB wasn't glamorous. He was stationed in Dresden, East Germany, far from Moscow's political elite. He sat behind a desk, monitored files, and watched the Soviet machine unravel slowly before his eyes. And then one night in 1989, it shattered. When the Berlin Wall fell, a mob stormed his KGB building. Putin called Moscow for orders. The response? Silence. Moscow had gone dark. No instructions, no backup. It was a moment that would scar him deeply, a moment where he realized the empire he served could vanish without warning, leaving even its loyal soldiers stranded. That moment, according to many who've studied him, birthed something cold and unforgiving inside him. The empire had failed. But Putin never forgave that collapse. He would carry its weight forever. When he returned to Russia in the early 90s, everything had changed. The Soviet Union had fallen. Chaos ruled. Oligarchs sliced the economy into pieces. Politicians sold influence like cigarettes. The once mighty Red Army looked like a dying relic. The Russian people were humiliated, starving, lost. Into that void came Vladimir Putin. He started quietly as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. But his real power began to grow when he entered the Kremlin under President Boris Yeltsin. The old vodka-soaked Yeltsin saw something in Putin: loyalty, obedience, and above all, someone who wouldn't betray him. In 1999, when Yeltsin suddenly resigned, the presidency was handed to Vladimir Putin, almost overnight. It was one of the fastest ascents to power in modern political history. At first, the world barely noticed. A bland-faced bureaucrat, a temporary caretaker, or so they thought. But within months, Russia began to change. Apartment bombings rocked Moscow. Hundreds died. The attacks were blamed on Chechen separatists. But controversy swirls to this day. Some insiders whispered it was a false flag, a manufactured crisis to rally the people behind a new strongman. Whether true or not, the outcome was undeniable. Fear gripped the nation, and Putin offered control. He launched the Second Chechen War with brutal precision. He crushed opposition in the name of unity, and he told the Russian people what they wanted to hear: that their humiliation had ended, that Russia would rise again, and that he, Vladimir Putin, would never let them be weak again, and they believed him. His approval soared. The oligarchs who challenged him, exiled, imprisoned, or silenced. The press, intimidated or taken over the parliament. Reduced to a rubber stamp. Putin had studied the mistakes of the Soviet Union, its rigid bureaucracy, its public arrogance, its economic stagnation, and avoided them with ruthless adaptability. He allowed capitalism, but only under his watch. He permitted opposition, but only if it posed no real threat. Above all, he controlled the narrative. He became the story, bare-chested on horseback. Hunting in the Siberian wild, flying jets, diving in submarines, scoring goals in hockey matches staged for cameras. He wasn't just a president, it was a myth in the making. A modern czar with the aura of invincibility. But behind the photos and propaganda was a man with a mission. He saw Russia's sphere of influence as sacred. He believed the West, NATO, the EU, the US, had betrayed Russia, surrounded it, insulted it, and he would not let that go unanswered. Ukraine became the line in the sand. The 2014 annexation of Crimea wasn't a sudden impulse. It was the culmination of years of resentment, strategic planning, and psychological warfare. He didn't just seize land, he seized history, declaring that Crimea had always been Russian, that the West had no right to intervene. The world responded with sanctions, outrage, and condemnation. But Putin didn't flinch. In fact, he grew bolder. Because every punishment reinforced his message to the Russian people. The West fears us. They want to control us. And I am the only thing standing in their way. But the question still burns beneath it all. Is Putin truly a nationalist, or is he a survivor cloaked in patriotism? It's a man seeking greatness for Russia. It's a man seeking immortality for himself. It's easy to mistake Vladimir Putin for a cold, calculating dictator, an isolated man commanding a nation through raw intimidation. But the truth is darker. He's not just reacting to the world, he's shaping it. One secret operation, one silenced opponent, one manipulated election at a time. The strategy isn't obvious, it isn't chaotic, it's chess, low, deliberate, and dangerous. While the West celebrated the fall of the Iron Curtain, Putin saw only betrayal. Watched as former Soviet republics turn toward NATO, toward Europe, toward Washington, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, gone, Georgia, and Ukraine. Teetering on the edge, to him, NATO's eastern expansion wasn't diplomacy, it was an invasion in disguise. And so behind the walls of the Kremlin, he began building a new kind of warfare. One that didn't rely on tanks or bombs, but on confusion, division, and doubt. In 2007, Putin delivered a chilling speech in Munich. He accused the US of undermining international law, of imposing its will through force, and of acting as if it were above consequences. It was a warning, cloaked in diplomacy. Most in the West shrugged it off. They shouldn't have. Because while Western democracies grew complacent, Putin began rewriting the rules of modern conflict. Cyber warfare, disinformation, proxy militias, weaponized energy. He knew Russia couldn't outmatch NATO with brute strength, but it could destabilize it from the inside. In 2008, Russian troops poured into Georgia. The West protested. Sanctions followed. But the message was clear. Putin would not allow former Soviet satellites to escape Moscow's influence. Then came Ukraine. In 2014, with the world distracted by Syria, ISIS, and economic woes, Putin struck. Crimea was annexed almost overnight. No declaration, no drawn-out campaign. Just masked troops, little green men, taking over key buildings, backed by a propaganda machine that convinced many Russians the region had been liberated. The West again responded with sanctions. But by then, Putin had already secured Crimea, and with it, a Black Sea stronghold Russia had long coveted. But he wasn't done. Ukraine descended into war. Pro-Russian separatists, allegedly backed by Moscow, clashed with Ukrainian forces in the east. Civilians died. Planes were shot down. Europe looked on, horrified, but paralyzed. Meanwhile, inside Russia, Putin's grip only tightened. Crushed protests with swift brutality. He restructured the constitution, painted all dissenters as foreign agents or traitors to the motherland. And still, his approval soared. Because for many Russians, Putin wasn't just a president. He was revenge. Revenge for the humiliation of the 1990s. Revenge for the collapse of the USSR. Revenge for being treated as a second-rate. Power by the West. But perhaps his boldest move wasn't on a battlefield. It was behind computer screens. In 2016, U.S. intelligence agencies revealed a coordinated Russian effort to meddle in the American presidential election. Hacked emails, troll farms, misinformation campaigns. The goal? Not necessarily to elect a specific candidate, but to destabilize trust. In democracy itself, it worked. The same tactics were later used in Brexit campaigns, French elections, and anti-EU movements across Europe. Putin wasn't sending missiles, he was sending ideas. Viruses of confusion, doubt, and fear. The West, for all its wealth and technology, seemed unprepared. At home, his enemies began to fall like dominoes. Boris Nemtsov, a vocal critic, shot dead outside the Kremlin. Alexander Litvinenko poisoned with radioactive polonium in London. Sergei Skripal, a former spy, nearly killed by a nerve agent in Salisbury, an attack that endangered British civilians and provoked international outrage. And yet, time after time, Russia denied involvement. With a smirk, with mockery, with silence. Putin didn't need to take credit. The fear was enough. The uncertainty even better, because that's the heart of Putinism. Not just power, but perception. He doesn't want the world to know what he's doing. He wants the world to doubt everything. Truth becomes negotiable, facts become blurry, and in the fog he becomes untouchable. But what does he truly want? Some say he dreams of restoring the Soviet Union, not necessarily in borders, but in influence. Others believe he's driven by insecurity, a former spy haunted by the collapse of the empire he once served. Others see something even more chilling, a man obsessed with legacy. Not just surviving power, but eternal power. It's a kind that turns names into myths, that builds statues, that shapes history books. In 2022, the world once again watched in horror as Russian forces invaded Ukraine. This time openly, brazenly, with tanks, artillery, and mass destruction. The goal was clear: break Ukraine's will and show the world that Putin was still a force to be feared. But it didn't go as planned. Ukrainian resistance was fierce. The West, finally unified, responded with unprecedented sanctions, military support, and diplomatic isolation. Russia's economy reeled. Thousands died. Yet Putin pressed on, because at this point, retreat isn't an option. Putin has built a throne from illusion and force. And like all rulers who stand too long, he's trapped by his own legend. If he falters, he risks collapse. It's not just politically, but personally. And he knows it. He has no obvious successor, no exit plan, no peaceful retirement, only a legacy to defend, by any means necessary. That's what makes him dangerous. Not just his weapons, not just his spies, but the fact that he's a man cornered by his own empire, a man willing to burn the map to redraw the borders, a man convinced that the world is out to get him and determined to strike before it does. Inside the mind of Vladimir Putin, paranoia isn't a symptom, it's a strategy. Isolation isn't a weakness, it's protection. Power isn't just control, it's survival. So, as the world watches, as leaders gather, and nations brace for whatever comes next, the question remains: what does Vladimir Putin do when the world finally stops playing his game? Because make no mistake, this isn't just Russia's story, it's ours. The story of how one man's obsession with control, legacy, and fear became a global threat, and how far he'll go. No one can predict,